Humanity has fought for its freedom, but the battle is far from over. Will you stand with the resistance? Like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to follow the journey as humanity's fight for justice continues. Join the fight, share the story, and be part of the revolution that's reshaping the galaxy. For centuries, humanity had been little more than a shadow in the vast expanse of the galaxy. The Veylar, an ancient and highly advanced alien race, had dominated the known universe, enslaving humanity as their subjugated species. They ruled with an iron fist, their technology far beyond anything the human race could even comprehend. Planets burned, cities fell, and entire populations were wiped out by the sheer might of the Veylar. It was a brutal, relentless existence. But in the deepest corners of the galaxy, something was stirring. An idea, a whisper, a spark of defiance. The Veylar had grown complacent. The endless years of domination had dulled their vigilance. They had taken humanity's spirit, crushed it underfoot, and believed it would never rise again. But they underestimated one thing, the will of the human race. It started small. A rogue fleet of human ships, outcasts and rebels from across the galaxy, led by a mysterious ex-commander whose name was only whispered in legend. He had once been a decorated officer in the Veylar's intergalactic military, but after a devastating betrayal that left his entire unit annihilated, he had vanished. The Veylar had assumed he was dead, but they were wrong. The commander had been plotting, biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. That moment came with the sudden appearance of his fleet, uniting dozens of scattered human factions that had lived in hiding, avoiding the Veylar's watchful eye for years. They had suffered, yes, but they had not been defeated. As the fleet engaged in a series of successful skirmishes, each victory was a crack in the Veylar's invincible armor. Human ships, once considered obsolete and weak, began to outsmart their oppressors, using guerrilla tactics and unpredictable maneuvers to launch devastating attacks against Veylar convoys, outposts, and supply lines. The first few victories were enough to turn heads across the galaxy. Other oppressed races began to take notice. The Veylar's hold on the galaxy was slipping, and humans, whom they had viewed as nothing more than vermin, were suddenly standing tall. But the Veylar, in their arrogance, were slow to respond. The fleet's victories seemed like mere anomalies. Until they weren't. Until the rogue commander, known only as the Ghost of Veylar, led a devastating assault on one of their most heavily fortified space stations, crippling their military communications. The attack was swift, brutal, and precise, leaving the Veylar in chaos. And then the war began. The Veylar, desperate to reassert control over their galaxy, unleashed their full might in retaliation. But humanity had found its strength. The rogue commander wasn't just fighting for revenge. He was fighting for something far greater, the survival of his species. With every battle, more humans rallied to his cause, eager to free themselves from centuries of slavery. Now it's a race against time. The Veylar may be the most advanced species in the galaxy, but humanity's resilience, ingenuity, and hunger for freedom could just be the key to tipping the scales. The question is no longer if humanity can defeat the Veylar. It's whether they can do it before the entire galaxy falls into the hands of tyranny once again. The last stand of humanity has begun, and this time the fight is not just for survival, it's for justice. The Veylar had ruled the galaxy for centuries. To them, humanity was a mere nuisance, a primitive species that had been tamed, bent to their will, and forced into servitude. The vastness of space had once seemed like an insurmountable frontier, but for the Veylar, it was simply another playground. From their citadels of power, they watched as humans, scattered and divided, had little hope of ever rising against them. The oppressive reign of the Veylar had been long, and they grew complacent. Their belief in their superiority was unshakable. Humanity, however, had always possessed a strength that the Veylar overlooked. For centuries, the human race had been subjected to the whims of their oppressors, their cities destroyed, their families torn apart. But the human spirit had never been fully broken. Even in the darkest corners of the galaxy, where the Veylar thought they had silenced any hope, whispers of rebellion began to stir. In the shadow of Veylar oppression, humanity had survived. But survival wasn't enough anymore. The human race was waking up, realizing that the impossible was within reach. They were beginning to fight back. The first spark came not from the vast fleets of warships or the military commanders long lost to the galaxy's forgotten corners, but from an unlikely source. An ex-commander of the Veylar's own elite forces, a man who had once fought under their banner, had vanished years ago after a devastating betrayal. His name had been erased from Veylar records, his status forgotten, but he wasn't dead. The commander, whose name had become a ghost in the Veylar's eyes, had spent years in exile, biding his time. This ex-commander had seen the true face of the Veylar. He had been part of their grand military campaigns, participating in the brutal suppression of human colonies, watching as entire worlds fell under the iron grip of the Veylar. He had been a soldier, an instrument of destruction, until one fateful day when everything changed. During a mission to eliminate a human resistance group on a distant planet, the commander had discovered something that shattered his belief in the Veylar's righteous cause. As he led his forces to wipe out the humans, he witnessed the atrocities committed by the Veylar. The same tactics used to dominate the galaxy were being employed on a human colony that had been rendered helpless, pushed to the brink of extinction. It wasn't war to the Veylar, it was genocide. The commander had been tasked with executing the final blow to a human city, a city that had surrendered, only to be massacred in cold blood. At that moment, the commander had realized the truth. The Veylar did not conquer for peace or order. They conquered for control, for dominance, for their own self-serving ideals. Haunted by the death of innocents and disillusioned by the Veylar's goals, the commander made a life-altering decision. He turned his back on everything he had known, vanishing into shadows, abandoning his comrades and the empire he had served so loyally. He knew what he was doing would mark him for death in the eyes of the Veylar. They would never forgive his defection. But in the depths of his heart, he knew that humanity could not be allowed to remain oppressed forever. He became a rogue, a fugitive, but one with a singular purpose: to ignite the flame of resistance and awaken humanity from its centuries-long slumber. And so, he began to gather those who had once been subjugated, the scattered remnants of humanity that had survived. He reached out to the human factions hidden across the galaxy, to those who had been pushed to the fringes, discarded by the Veylar but still filled with a fierce will to survive. He sought out those with a thirst for freedom, a fire burning within them to reclaim their home from the aliens that had stolen it. The human resistance had always been fragmented, operating in isolated cells, constantly under Veylar surveillance. But with the commander's leadership, they began to unite. The first steps were small: raids on Veylar convoys, sabotage of communication networks, and the liberation of small colonies. But each success fueled a fire of rebellion. The humans who had once been cogs in the Veylar war machine now found themselves fighting back with something far stronger than technology: unity and a belief in their right to exist free from oppression. As the rogue human fleet grew in numbers, the Veylar were forced to take notice. At first, they dismissed these attacks as mere nuisances, isolated incidents that could be dealt with easily. But the humans kept coming. They struck with precision, using tactics that the Veylar had never anticipated from a species they considered weak and disorganized. They adapted, learned quickly, and pushed the Veylar back from their territories. The rogue commander's fleet, led by the human spirit of rebellion, began to win battles. Small victories at first, but each one a clear sign that humanity was no longer willing to remain silent. It didn't take long for the Veylar to realize that what had started as a series of minor skirmishes was becoming something far more dangerous. The rogue human fleet wasn't going away. It wasn't just a handful of rebels. It was a movement. And the humans weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their future. The Veylar, once so confident in their unchallenged dominance, began to panic. The commander, who had once been a cog in their war machine, had become their greatest threat. The humans had found a leader, a symbol of defiance who was inspiring a revolution. What had begun as one man's fight for justice had ignited a fire that was spreading across the galaxy, uniting humans under a common cause. The Veylar could not afford to let this continue. What had been a series of small rebellions had now grown into an existential threat. The humans, united under the banner of the rogue commander, were no longer just a nuisance. They were a force to be reckoned with, and the Veylar knew that if they allowed humanity to rise, their empire would be threatened. In response, the Veylar prepared for war. The full might of their technologically superior fleet was called into action. The battle for the galaxy had begun, and for humanity, it was no longer about survival. It was about reclaiming their freedom, their future, and their place in the galaxy. The last stand of humanity had begun. The rogue human fleet had quickly become a thorn in the side of the Veylar, but to the humans, it was much more than that. It was a symbol, a beacon of hope that flickered brightly in the darkest corners of the galaxy. They had started as a small band of rebels, but under the leadership of the rogue commander, they were becoming something greater. The commander, once a symbol of human defeat in the Veylar's military ranks, was now the catalyst for humanity's resurgence. His name had become a rallying cry for every human who had suffered under the Veylar's reign, and soon the galaxy would know him as the Ghost of Veylar. As humanity's scattered factions began to unite, the commander's vision became clear. The Veylar were not invincible. The humans, despite being vastly outmatched in terms of technology, had one thing the Veylar had long since lost: the will to fight for freedom. The rogue fleet was not just a military force. It was an idea. It was a spark that could ignite an entire galaxy. But the Veylar, aware of the growing threat, were no fools. They had underestimated humanity at first, dismissing the rogue fleet as a minor nuisance. However, the humans had already begun making an impact. They had struck key Veylar convoys, sabotaged supply lines, and crippled communication networks. Each victory, though small, was a sign of something far bigger, the beginning of a human uprising. The Veylar's complacency had left them vulnerable. For centuries, they had ruled with an iron fist, keeping other species under their control, but they had grown arrogant. They no longer saw humans as a serious threat. They saw them as a weak, subjugated race, bound to their will. But the more the humans fought back, the more it became clear that this would not be an easy conquest. As the commander's fleet continued to grow, more and more human factions rallied to their cause. What had started as a handful of renegades had transformed into a full-fledged resistance movement. From the desolate mining colonies in the Outer Rim to the bustling trade worlds in the center of the galaxy, humans began to unite. Former Veylar allies, once seen as untouchable, turned their backs on their oppressive masters, secretly offering help to rebellion. It was a movement that spread like wildfire, fueled by the promise of freedom and the hope that the Veylar could be overthrown. In the midst of this growing resistance, the rogue fleet's first real victory came when they struck the Veylar's prized communications hub, a massive station located deep within the heart of Veylar-controlled space. It was a bold move, one that many of the fleet's commanders had doubted. But the commander's plan was simple and ruthless. Attack where the Veylar least expected. The station, which served as the brain of Veylar military operations, was a nerve center, controlling communications, tactics, and fleet movements across the galaxy. The attack was swift, precise, and devastating. The humans disabled the station's defense systems, neutralized its power grid, and crippled the Veylar's ability to coordinate their fleets. It was a decisive strike, and it sent shockwaves to the Veylar Empire. For the first time in centuries, the Veylar were forced to retreat, and the humans had made their mark. But victory did not come without a price. The commander's fleet lost several ships in the attack, and many good men and women gave their lives to the cause. Yet, in the wake of the battle, the commander stood before his fleet, battered and scarred, but filled with pride. The Veylar had finally felt the sting of defeat, and humanity had proven that it would not go quietly into the night. The news of the victory spread quickly, carried by both human and sympathetic alien news outlets. For the first time, the galaxy's oppressed species began to believe that liberation was possible. Across planets, in the densest of cities and the furthest reaches of space, people began to stand tall. They saw the humans, who had once been nothing more than slaves and subjects, rising up to challenge the mightiest empire the galaxy had ever known. But the Veylar, though shaken, were not defeated. They had underestimated the strength of humanity, and now they would respond in kind. The Veylar High Council, furious at the audacity of the human fleet, called for full-scale retaliation. They saw the commander's success not as a sign of weakness, but as a direct challenge to their authority, and they would not allow such defiance to go unpunished. The war had officially begun. The Veylar's response was swift, brutal, and overwhelming. After the unexpected defeat of their communications hub, the High Council of the Veylar knew that humanity could no longer be dismissed as a mere nuisance. The human rebellion had gone from a scattered group of misfit rebels to a full-fledged resistance movement. They had broken the first rule of conquest: never let the oppressed gain confidence. The rogue fleet, now a symbol of human defiance, had shaken the Veylar Empire to its core. The Veylar had underestimated the power of unity, the power of a people fighting for their freedom. They had thought that the humans would crumble, that the centuries of subjugation would have left them docile. But they were wrong. The rebellion, led by the rogue commander, was gaining momentum. News of the victory spread like wildfire across the galaxy, from the barren wastelands of forgotten colonies to the vibrant urban sprawls of once proud planets. People who had long ago lost hope saw the humans stand up to their oppressors and realized that they, too, could rise. Alien species who had been forced to serve the Veylar saw the humans not as the weak species they'd been told to believe, but as the spark that could light a galaxy-wide revolution. The fight for freedom was no longer just about human survival. It was about the survival of every oppressed species under the Veylar's thumb. But while the Veylar were shaken, they were not unprepared. They knew the strength of humanity's resolve, and they knew they had to act before the rebellion spread too far. The Veylar High Council mobilized their full military might, calling in reinforcements from across the galaxy. Their warships, the pinnacle of intergalactic warfare, were dispatched to crush the human resistance once and for all. Their first target was a homeworld of the rogue commander, the very place where humanity's uprising had begun. The rogue commander, aware of the Veylar's inevitable response, knew the battle to come would be the true test of humanity's resolve. He had spent years building this rebellion, but now he would need more than just courage. He would need a strategy to unite the scattered human fleets and fight a superior force. If they didn't stand together now, if they didn't make the stand their last, humanity would be wiped out before they could truly rise. As the Veylar warships began to approach, the rogue commander called for a meeting of the fleet leaders. Ships from every corner of the galaxy had rallied under his banner. The survivors of the human colonies, the outlawed military units, the resistance fighters from the darkest depths of space. They all answered the call. They knew that their future depended on this battle, that this moment would define the fate of their species. The commander's fleet, though far from the Veylar's technological superiority, was resilient. They were survivors, and that survival had honed their instincts. The humans didn't have the numbers or the resources, but they had something the Veylar couldn't understand: a fierce will to win, a refusal to submit to tyranny. The commander had seen the heart of humanity in action. This battle wasn't just about strategy. It was about survival. And with that knowledge, the commander began to devise a plan that would give humanity a fighting chance. The humans had one advantage. They knew their enemy. They had once served under the Veylar's command, and the rogue commander knew exactly how the Veylar's military operated. Their ships, while powerful, were predictable. Their reliance on overwhelming firepower meant they underestimated the importance of strategy. The commander intended to exploit that weakness. He called his fleet to action, gathering them for what would be the defining moment in their struggle for survival. "We fight not just for us," the commander said, addressing his fleet over the comms. "We fight for everyone who has ever been silenced. We fight for every soul who has been crushed under the Veylar's heel. This battle is ours, and we will show the galaxy that humanity will not be forgotten." The plan was set into motion, and the human fleet began to assemble in the shadows of a nearby asteroid field. They would strike quickly and decisively. The Veylar fleet, in its arrogance, would assume they could pick off the humans with ease. But they would learn quickly that underestimating humanity's capacity for resistance would be their biggest mistake. As the first Veylar ships entered the system, the rogue fleet moved into position, hidden among the asteroids, ready to strike. The humans didn't need to match the Veylar's firepower. They just needed to be smarter. The attack would be swift and brutal, hitting the Veylar where they were weakest. The humans, despite their lack of resources, had learned to use every advantage, from their knowledge of Veylar tactics to their ability to adapt in the heat of battle. The first salvo of the battle was deafening. The Veylar ships, though initially caught off guard, retaliated with their usual overwhelming firepower. But the humans had already set their trap. They used the asteroid field to their advantage, weaving through the rocks and debris, launching hit-and-run strikes that crippled the Veylars' front lines. The battle raged on, but the humans were winning, not through sheer might, but through cunning and unity. And as the Veylars' flagship moved into position to end the fight, the rogue commander made his move. With the last of their energy reserves, the human fleet launched a final, desperate attack, targeting the heart of the Veylars' military. The Veylar flagship, once thought invincible, was now in the sights of humanity's finest hour. This battle would not be humanity's last, but it would be their first great victory, and it would ignite the fires of revolution across the galaxy. The battle was far from over, but the humans had dealt the Veylar a blow they had never expected. For the first time in centuries, the Veylar had tasted defeat, and the humans had proven they were no longer the subjugated species they once were. The victory, however, was bittersweet. The human fleet had sustained heavy casualties, and the cost of the battle was evident in the wreckage scattered across the asteroid field. But as the dust settled, one thing was clear. Humanity was no longer just surviving. They were fighting back. The Veylar, in their arrogance, had believed their dominance was absolute. But the rogue commander, with his unparalleled knowledge of their tactics, had turned their greatest strength against them. The Veylar ships, with their advanced weapons and superior technology, had underestimated the ingenuity and determination of a human fleet. They had assumed that the humans would fold under pressure, that their superior numbers and technology would crush the resistance. Instead, they had faced a fleet of human ships that refused to back down, no matter the odds. In the aftermath of the battle, the rogue commander addressed his fleet. The humans who had fought so fiercely, who had risked everything to secure their first victory, looked to him for guidance. His voice, steady and resolute, echoed across the comms, reaching every ship in the fleet. "We've won the first battle," he said, "but this is just the beginning. The Veylar will retaliate with everything they have. They will not forget this humiliation, but we will not stop. This war is about more than just survival. It's about reclaiming what was taken from us. It's about proving to the galaxy that humanity will not be ruled. We fight for freedom, for justice, for all the lives that have been lost under the Veylar's reign. We will take back our future." His words resonated deeply with every member of the fleet. For the first time in a long while, the humans felt something they had long lost: hope. They weren't just a scattered, defeated race anymore. They were a united force, driven by a common cause. And that cause had given them the strength to stand against an empire that had ruled over them for so long. The news of their victory spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Rebellions began to flare up on Veylar-controlled worlds, and other oppressed species, long kept in check, began to rise up alongside the humans. The Veylar, in their overconfidence, had made a critical mistake. They had underestimated humanity's will to fight, and now the galaxy was waking up to the possibility that the Veylar's reign might soon come to an end. But the Veylar were not going to go down without a fight. Their High Council, humiliated by the defeat, ordered an immediate response. They called for a full-scale retaliation, assembling their most powerful warships and preparing for an all-out assault on the human fleet. The Veylar knew that if they didn't crush the rebellion now, it would only grow stronger. They could not afford another loss, especially one that had sparked a galaxy-wide uprising. Their pride was on the line, and the Veylar were not a species known for tolerating failure. As the Veylar prepared for war, the rogue commander knew the next battle would be the true test. The Veylar were coming for them, and they would not hesitate to use their full might. The humans had to be ready. In the midst of this looming threat, the rogue commander turned his most trusted allies. The time had come to build an alliance with the other oppressed species of the galaxy. The humans couldn't win this war alone. They needed to unite the galaxy against the Veylar. They needed to forge a coalition of resistance groups, each bringing their own strengths to the fight. The Veylar had relied on fear and division to maintain control, but the commander believed that unity could be the key to victory. He began reaching out to the leaders of the most powerful resistance movements, extending an olive branch to those who had once been enemies. The message was simple: join forces or perish alone. The Veylar were coming for everyone, and if they didn't unite, they would all fall. The rogue commander's reputation had already begun to spread. not just as a former Veylar officer, but as a symbol of resistance. He had fought against his own people, and now he was fighting for something far greater, the survival of all those who had been oppressed. It was a gamble. The different factions of the galaxy had their own grievances and distrusts. But the rogue commander had no choice. If they didn't unite, the Veylar would crush them one by one. The human fleet, though powerful and united in spirit, was still outmatched by the might of the Veylar. They needed more. They needed a galaxy-wide rebellion. As the rogue commander sent out his call for unity, humanity prepared for the next phase of the war. The Veylar were not just coming for their homeworld. They were coming for every planet that had dared to defy them. The humans, though battle-worn, stood resolute. They had tasted victory, and they would not stop until they had reclaimed everything that had been taken from them. The full-scale war between the Veylar and the human rebellion had begun. The rogue commander's message had spread across the galaxy, and the once distant dream of freedom had ignited a flame that was impossible to extinguish. Humanity, joined by a coalition of oppressed species, was now facing down their greatest enemy. Every battle had brought them closer to the moment they would either reclaim their homeworld or be obliterated by the might of the Veylar. The Veylar, furious after their defeat, had brought their full military power to bear. Their fleet, vast and imposing, had assembled in the darkest corners of the galaxy. The commander knew this final confrontation would be their greatest challenge. The Veylar had not just learned from their previous mistakes. They were adapting, evolving their tactics in response to the unexpected resilience of a human resistance. The stakes had never been higher, and the battle to come would decide the fate of the galaxy. As the Veylar fleet gathered, the rogue commander's forces did the same. The human fleet, though smaller, was now a force to be reckoned with. Every ship was a symbol of defiance, each one manned by soldiers who had once been oppressed but now fought for freedom. The coalition of alien species had contributed their own ships, technologies, and warriors, uniting in a way that the Veylar could never have anticipated. The galaxy was no longer divided. It was united in a common cause, to overthrow the Veylar and restore peace to the stars. The final battle would take place in the heart of Veylar-controlled space, near the edge of a dying star. The rogue commander had chosen this location strategically, hoping to use the gravitational pull of the star to his advantage. The human fleet would not engage in a frontal assault. They would use their smaller size and agility to strike swiftly and unexpectedly, exploiting every weakness in the Veylar's vast armada. The human resistance had learned the art of guerrilla warfare, and now they would put that knowledge to use on the grandest scale. The day before the battle, the rogue commander stood alone on the command deck of his flagship, staring out into the vast expanse of space. He could feel the weight of what was about to happen, the lives that would be lost, the sacrifices that would be made. But he also knew that there was no turning back. This was humanity's last chance for survival. They could either die fighting for their freedom, or they could live as slaves for the rest of their existence. The commander's thoughts were interrupted by a quiet voice behind him. It was his most trusted officer, the one who fought alongside him from the beginning. "We're ready," she said, her voice calm but filled with unspoken tension. "The fleet is prepared. The coalition forces are in position. We're ready for the final strike." The rogue commander turned to face her. "Tomorrow we make our stand," he said. "But remember, this is not just about us. This is about every species in the galaxy that has been oppressed by the Veylar. Tomorrow we fight for them too." The officer nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "We'll win. We have to." The next day, the fleets moved into position. The Veylar, unaware of the humans' final strategy, advanced confidently. They believed their superiority was unquestionable, and the human resistance would soon be crushed. But the rogue commander's plan was already in motion. The human fleet, along with their allies, moved swiftly through the asteroid field near the dying star, setting up traps and ambushes. The Veylar, for all their power, were not prepared for such a fight. They had grown complacent. The first salvo of the battle was deafening. The Veylar unleashed their full arsenal, their warships firing powerful energy beams that illuminated the battlefield. But the humans were ready. Their ships darted between the asteroids, evading the Veylar's attacks with surprising speed and precision. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse, with the Veylar's larger ships struggling to keep up with the humans' guerrilla tactics. The battle raged on, with explosions lighting up the dark void of space, but humanity's resolve was unshakable. As the battle continued, the Rogue Commander's flagship moved the heart of the Veylar formation. His plan was simple: destroy the Veylar command center and cripple their ability to coordinate their forces. With a final, decisive strike, he launched a barrage of missiles directly at the Veylar's flagship. The missiles pierced the hull, causing massive explosions that sent shockwaves throughout the Veylar fleet. The Veylar flagship, their pride and joy, was now crippled, and the humans seized the opportunity. With their command center destroyed, the Veylar's forces began to falter. The human fleet, emboldened by their success, launched a final assault, pushing the Veylar back and forcing them into retreat. The battle had been long and costly, but humanity had emerged victorious. The Veylar, once invincible, had been defeated by the sheer will of those they had oppressed. The galaxy, though scarred by war, now had a chance to rebuild. As the human fleet watched the Veylar retreat into the depths of space, the Rogue Commander allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The galaxy had been forever changed, and humanity had proven that no empire, no matter how powerful, could hold them down forever. The last stand of humanity had been won, but the fight for the future was just beginning. The battle was over. The Veylar fleet, shattered and broken, retreated into the depths of space, leaving the human fleet victorious. The once impossible dream, the thought that humanity could stand up to their oppressors, had become a reality. The Veylar, the self-proclaimed rulers of the galaxy, had been outwitted and outmatched by a species they had long dismissed as weak. Now, humanity stood united, their first great victory marking the beginning of a new era. As the remnants of the Veylar fleet vanished into the void, the human ships lingered in the quiet aftermath. The wreckage of the battle surrounded them, but amidst the chaos, there was something undeniable: hope. The once battered human fleet, scarred but proud, began to regroup and celebrate their hard-won success. In every ship, from a flagship to the smallest fighter, crews cheered, raised their voices in relief, and embraced one another. The commander, standing on the bridge of his flagship, allowed himself a brief moment of triumph. His people, who had fought so bravely and suffered for so long, had finally claimed their freedom. The news of the victory spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The oppressed species who had long been under the thumb of the Veylar now looked to humanity for guidance. This was no longer just a human victory. It was a victory for all those who had been silenced, oppressed, and dominated. The battle for freedom had begun, and humanity had shown that, no matter how powerful the oppressor, no one could ever truly be defeated if they had the will to fight. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in centuries, humanity stood together with the future in their hands, no longer under the shadow of tyranny.